I didn't see my life end. I felt it stop. There was a clear moment where my body just shut off. No tunnel. No light at first. Just the sudden understanding that whatever was holding me together had let go. My name is Rachel Bloom. I was 34 years old when I died. That's not a metaphor. My heart stopped after an accident on a rainy afternoon, and for a short time, there was no medical explanation for how I came back. Doctors later used words like unlikely and rare. None of that matches what it felt like. What stayed with me wasn't fear. That surprised me. I always assumed death would feel like panic, like drowning or falling. Instead, it felt like a door closing quietly behind me. Final. Clean. The unsettling part came later, when I realized how aware I was after that door closed. I knew my name. I knew my age. I knew something had gone wrong. And I knew, with complete certainty, that the life I'd been living seconds earlier was no longer something I could return to on my own. There was no sense of floating or drifting yet. It was more like standing still in a place that didn't belong to time. I wasn't afraid, but I wasn't comfortable either. It felt serious. Heavy. Like waiting for news you already know is bad. What disturbed me most was how familiar it all felt. As if I had been there before, or at least expected to be there eventually. There was no confusion about being dead. That understanding arrived fully formed. I remember thinking, very calmly, so this is what happens. This is the part nobody talks about. And then something shifted. Not around me. Inside me. Like attention turning in a direction I hadn't noticed before. That was when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Before that day, my life was ordinary in the most unremarkable way. That's important. Nothing about me felt chosen or special. I worked a desk job in logistics for a regional company. Emails, schedules, small deadlines that always felt urgent and never really were. I lived alone in a small apartment with mismatched furniture and plants I kept forgetting to water. My biggest weekly decision was whether I had the energy to cook or would just eat something fast and salty. I wasn't unhappy. I also wasn't deeply fulfilled. I thought that was normal. I believed fear was just part of being human. You worried about money, about getting older, about wasting time. You distracted yourself and moved on. I didn't think fear meant anything beyond biology and habit. Spiritually, I hovered in the middle. I believed in something, but not in a way that demanded attention. Jesus was a name I associated with childhood stories and other people's certainty. I didn't reject it. I just didn't need it. My days followed a predictable rhythm. Commute. Work. Gym when I felt motivated. Phone scrolling at night until sleep took over. I told myself I had time to figure out what mattered later. That morning started like any other. Coffee tasted slightly burnt. I was running a few minutes behind. I remember being mildly annoyed at the rain because it meant traffic would be worse. There was no sense of warning. No intuition. No feeling of this is the last normal day. If anything, I was thinking about something small and stupid, like whether I'd remembered to send an attachment. That's the part that still bothers me. How unprepared I was. Not practically. Internally. I didn't feel fragile. I felt permanent. And then the rhythm broke. The accident itself didn't feel dramatic. That's what people expect, but it wasn't like that. I was driving through an intersection I'd crossed hundreds of times. The light was green. The rain had turned the road into a dull mirror. I saw movement to my left too late to react properly. There was a sound, but I don't remember it clearly. Metal folding in on itself. A sudden force that pushed the air out of my chest. The steering wheel jerked. My body followed without consent. Pain came and went too fast to register as pain. It was more like impact, then pressure, then nothing. I remember thinking, very briefly, this is bad. After that, time stopped behaving normally. There was a moment where everything slowed, not in a cinematic way, but in a stripped-down way. Details dropped out. No thoughts about family. No life flashing. Just awareness narrowing to a single point. I didn't feel myself losing consciousness. It felt more like consciousness letting go of the body. The last physical sensation I remember was heaviness. Not weight on me, but weight leaving me. Like sinking and lifting at the same time. Then silence. Not quiet. Silence. Complete. No internal dialogue. No ringing. No background hum. I didn't feel fear when my heart stopped. That realization came later, and it unsettled me more than fear would have. Something fundamental shut down, and my mind accepted it without protest. What I didn't know then was that this acceptance wasn't the end of awareness. It was the beginning of something much harder to understand. Awareness returned before sensation. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't breathe. I just noticed myself existing again. Fully clear. Sharper than I'd ever felt while alive. I was above the intersection. That's the only way I can describe it without pretending it made sense. I wasn't floating like in movies. I wasn't moving at all. I was simply positioned somewhere that gave me a complete view. Below me was my car. Crumpled in a way I didn't recognize at first. Rain streaking across broken glass. People standing too still, the way people do when something serious has happened. And inside the car, there was a body. It took a few seconds to understand it was mine. There was no shock. No denial. Just recognition. Like seeing a coat you used to wear and realizing it no longer belongs to you. I noticed details that felt strangely unimportant. One shoe twisted at an angle. My hand resting against the door. My hair stuck to my face. It all looked heavy. Unresponsive. What surprised me was how distant it felt emotionally. I didn't feel attached to it anymore. There was no instinct to return, no panic about fixing anything. I understood, without anyone telling me, that the body had stopped working. Sounds from the scene felt muted, like they were happening through thick glass. Sirens existed, but they didn't reach me. Voices moved mouths, but I couldn't hear words. What I could feel was clarity. Thoughts didn't race. They lined up. One after another. Clean. Calm. I knew I was dead. I knew it mattered. And I knew something else was about to happen. That certainty didn't come from logic. It came from presence. Something was close. Not behind me. Not in front of me. Closer than space allows. And when my attention turned toward it, everything else fell away. I felt the presence before I saw anything. It wasn't sudden. It didn't intrude. It was already there, and I was the one catching up to it. The closest word I have is weight, but not a heavy one. A steady one. Like standing near something powerful that doesn't need to announce itself. Then there was form. Not a figure stepping forward. More like clarity resolving into shape. Light, but not blinding. Defined, but not sharp. Real in a way that didn't require physical edges. I knew who it was without being told. That knowledge didn't arrive as a thought. It arrived as recognition. Immediate. Undeniable. Jesus. Saying the name now feels strange, because there was no name spoken there. No introduction. No explanation. Just the awareness that this presence was the one behind the stories I'd half believed and half dismissed my entire life. I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel comforted either. It was something deeper than both. I felt seen. Not observed. Not evaluated. Seen in a way that included everything I'd hidden from myself. There was no fear in that moment. That's important. I expected shame. I expected regret. None of that came. What I felt was stillness. A kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full. He didn't speak right away. And somehow, that silence communicated more than words could have. It told me I was safe enough to listen. And that listening would change me. When he finally did speak, it wasn't aloud. There was no sound. The message arrived whole. And it wasn't what I expected to hear first. The first thing he showed me wasn't my life. It was my understanding of fear. I saw it the way I had always believed it existed, a personal thing. An internal weakness. Something people managed differently depending on personality and upbringing. That belief dissolved instantly. Fear wasn't just inside individuals. It moved. I was shown something like a current. Invisible, but powerful. Flowing through crowds, through homes, through conversations that seemed harmless on the surface. People weren't choosing fear as much as absorbing it. I understood, suddenly, how quickly it spreads when people don't notice it happening. How easily it disguises itself as caution. As responsibility. As being informed. I had believed fear was a reaction to danger. That was wrong. Fear, I was shown, often creates the danger it claims to protect against. Not through events. Through decisions. Through silence. Through small compromises people make when they think safety comes from control. I saw moments from my own life where fear had shaped me without me ever naming it. Times I stayed quiet. Times I delayed things that mattered. Times I accepted less because it felt safer than risking loss. None of this was said accusingly. It was simply revealed. The most unsettling part was realizing how normal it all looked while it was happening. Jesus didn't tell me fear was evil. He showed me it was persuasive. And then, without explanation, the scene changed. I was no longer observing ideas. I was being shown a choice. I was standing somewhere that didn't feel like a place. There was no sky, no ground, no walls. Just space that held shape without needing structure. In front of me were two paths. That's the simplest way to describe them, even though they weren't roads. One was wide. Open. Bright in a soft, inviting way. People moved along it easily. Some were talking. Some were smiling. It looked familiar, like a continuation of normal life. The other was narrow. Not dark, but quiet. Almost empty. It didn't look dangerous. It just didn't look comfortable. No one explained anything. No voice said this is good or this is bad. But I felt the difference immediately. The wide path carried noise. Not loud sounds, but constant movement. Opinions. Reassurance. Distraction. Everyone on it seemed busy avoiding something they couldn't quite name. The narrow path felt exposed. Honest. Like nowhere to hide if you walked it. What unsettled me was realizing both paths were filled with people who thought they were safe. Some on the wide path looked confident. Certain. They believed numbers meant security. That agreement meant truth. On the narrow path, people moved slowly. Some hesitated. Some turned back. But those who kept going felt anchored. Not fearless. Just grounded. I wasn't told to choose. I understood that everyone already was. Every day. In small ways. Without noticing. And then the scene shifted again, before I could ask anything. I found myself inside something that looked like a city. Clean streets. Soft lighting. Buildings that felt modern and reassuring. Everything worked. Everything was efficient. Screens everywhere, quietly feeding information. People looked calm here. Relieved. Like they had finally found something stable. I felt it too at first. That sense of order. Predictability. Relief from uncertainty. But underneath it, something was missing. I noticed no one was really talking. They exchanged words, but not meaning. Conversation stayed shallow, looping around approved topics. Anything deeper stopped abruptly, like hitting an invisible wall. I realized fear lived here too, just better dressed. It hid behind comfort. Behind systems. Behind the promise that as long as things kept running, everything was fine. I saw how easily people traded truth for reassurance. How quickly they accepted rules that dulled their inner voice, as long as those rules reduced anxiety. No one here thought they were afraid. That was the deception. Jesus didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The emptiness spoke for itself. And then I was pulled out of that place, gently but firmly. This time, I was shown people one by one. They looked ordinary. Some kind. Some confident. Some respected. If I had passed them on the street, I wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. But I could see two layers at once. On the outside, they appeared composed. Successful. Morally certain. Inside, many were exhausted. Not physically. Spiritually. I saw how much effort it took to maintain appearances. To stay aligned with what was expected. To avoid questions that might destabilize their sense of belonging. Then I was shown quieter people. Less impressive. Less visible. Inside them, there was movement. Struggle. Doubt. But also honesty. A willingness to sit with discomfort instead of covering it. That's when I understood something painful. What looks strong isn't always alive. And what looks fragile often is. Jesus finally spoke again, not with words, but with understanding that settled deep inside me. What matters is rarely what survives the crowd. Before I could process that, everything began to tighten. Not around me. Inside me. I could feel time pressing in. The pressure didn't feel rushed. It felt focused. Like when a room goes quiet and you realize something important is about to be said, but no one raises their voice. I wasn't shown clocks. No dates. No disasters playing out on a screen. What I felt was narrowing. Windows closing without slamming shut. Jesus showed me how quickly fear accelerates when people stop listening inwardly. Not because something dramatic happens, but because uncertainty piles up faster than courage. I saw ordinary moments tipping into something heavier. A headline read without reflection. A conversation cut short because it felt uncomfortable. A decision made to avoid standing out. Each one seemed harmless. Together, they formed momentum. Fear spreads fastest, I understood, when people are tired. When they want relief more than truth. When silence feels safer than honesty. There was no accusation in this awareness. Just gravity. I sensed that time wasn't running out, it was being used. Every moment either sharpened people or softened them. There was no pause button. What unsettled me most was how gentle the warning felt. No urgency in tone. Just inevitability in direction. Like water flowing downhill. And then, without transition, I felt myself being pulled backward. Not dragged. Not forced. Called. The first thing I felt was resistance. I didn't want to go back. Not because where I was felt pleasurable. It didn't. It felt serious. But it felt true. Clear in a way life never had. Then came weight. Sudden. Crushing. Pain rushed in all at once, like sound after long silence. My chest burned. My limbs felt wrong, distant, heavy. I heard voices before I could understand them. Sharp. Urgent. Someone shouting numbers. Someone else saying my name, though it sounded unfamiliar. Breath slammed into me like an invasion. I remember gasping and choking, my body fighting me as much as I fought it. Panic arrived late, confused, without direction. For a brief moment, I was aware of both worlds at once. The clarity fading. The noise rising. That was the hardest part. Letting go of what made sense. When my eyes opened, light hurt. Everything felt too loud, too fast, too solid. I cried, not from pain, but from loss. Something essential had closed behind me. I don't talk about this often. Not because I'm afraid of being judged. Because words flatten it. They make it sound dramatic or symbolic when it wasn't. What I brought back with me wasn't answers. It was awareness. Fear isn't coming someday. It's already moving. Quietly. Through routines. Through compromises that feel reasonable at the time. And hope isn't loud. It doesn't compete well. It doesn't trend. It waits. If there's anything I want you to hear, it's this: pay attention to what you accept just to feel safe. Notice what you ignore because it's inconvenient. Nothing I was shown asked for perfection. Or certainty. Only honesty. I didn't come back changed overnight. I still struggle. I still hesitate. But I no longer confuse comfort with truth. And that alone has changed the way I move through this world.